The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years and, together with the Vice President chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. The Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution. Welcome to the Kentucky Gazette podcast, the Commonwealth's podcast on state government, politics, and public affairs. After the election of Donald Trump as president last fall, despite losing the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by more than 3 million votes, there was a lot of talk about getting rid of the Electoral College or changing the way the Electoral College works in the states. That inspired author, historian, and Kentucky Gazette contributor Ron Bryant to write an article on the Electoral College, and this week, Leo Haggerty sits down with Ron Bryant and discusses the Electoral College in more detail. Here's that interview.
On December 9th of last year, 8 Kentuckians met in the Supreme Court chambers at the state capitol in Frankfort, Kentucky. Similar groups met all across the United States, from Maine to Hawaii, for the same reason, to elect the President and Vice President of the United States. Well, wait a minute. I thought we did that November 8th. And that brings us to the topic of today's episode of the Kentucky Gazette podcast. Our guest is historian Ron Bryant, who is also a regular contributor of the Gazette. Ron, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is the Electoral College?
The Electoral College is a system to actually elect the President of the United States and the Vice President. The Founding Fathers had no intention of letting the average person vote for the President directly because they felt they were too uneducated, they felt that they were too uninformed, and so only the quote-unquote best people should be the ones who would actually vote for the President and Vice President.
So not exactly what most people are led to believe when they think of what democracy means.
Most Americans, I dare say, from the many I have talked to through the years, they really do not know that they're voting for an elector. They think they're voting directly for the person running for the office.
Okay, so Laura explained a little bit in the intro. So essentially, each state gets the number of congressmen and senators.
And senators, yes. Uh-huh.
But it has to be regular people. It can't be congressmen and senators.
They cannot be a person who holds high federal office. They cannot be a person who's had any background that would be criminal. You have to have something that would be someone that would be considered average. Yes, that would be a good term for them, except they're not average.
No, but
not at all. They're generally people high placed in the political parties.
Okay, so explain to us how electors are selected in Kentucky.
Well, in Kentucky, it is actually at the party levels, at their state conventions. A person is chosen because they can be offered some kind of thanks for their service to the party by giving them the electorship. And so they're chosen that way, and then they go and vote the way that they're basically told to vote. And that's the way it goes.
And how are electors selected in others, or some of the ways that electors are selected?
There's some that actually have a public election, and then at a congressional district that they will actually have more of a direct election, that there's people who are actually voting, on this, and not just the party leaders.
So actually in some states, it's the electors' names who show up on the ballot.
Some of the electors, yes. But when it comes down to the very thing of the presidential elections, always, of course, you are, or at least you're thinking you're voting for that individual who's running for the office.
Okay, let's go back to the Founding Fathers for a second. Were they looking at other procedures, or was it always going to be the Electoral College?
No, they tried to think of different procedures. In fact, one of the suggestions was that Congress elect the president, and that was shot down very quickly because there was too much chance of corruption there or undue influence.
No, corruption in Congress?
No, it's very surprising. but even at that time, they thought about those things, and then someone said, "Oh, let's have the legislators actually vote for the president," and then same thing, too much influence, corruption could happen there, and so they began to just try to figure out a way that somehow the most honest, most informed people would become the people who elected the president of the United States. One thing that they were in agreement on, they did not want the common person to actually elect the president. They were afraid of that.
Well, and that's also true with senators originally.
Oh, yes, the Senate was meant to be a very aristocratic body, and today it still is. It's, as they say, it's the millionaires club or the good old boys club, whatever you want to call it. But the
I think Elizabeth Warren would take umbrage at that.
Sure she would.
The good old boys and women's club, we'll call it.
Yes, that 19th century description has changed somewhat, but it is very, very interesting to note that the founders wanted a branch of government that would be considered based pretty much like on the ancient Senate of Rome, where only the very best families would be the ones who would be elected to that office.
Well, and Laura and I were talking about in the last episode the filibuster and the nuclear option, and the Senate is intended to be a deliberative body from
that was what it was intended to be from the very beginning. These were to be the people who were had the most gravitas, as the Romans would say, that they would deliberate the issues in a very nonpartisan way, what was best for the country. Of course, that changed very rapidly, too, through the years.
Okay, so over the course of history, how many times, which obviously this last time, which is part of what has made the Electoral College a lot more in the public mind, how many times has the winner of the popular vote been different from the winner in the Electoral College?
Five times.
Okay, I'm surprised. I know of three. So
1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and then the last election, 2016.
I knew the first and the last two. I did not know the middle ones.
Yes, the 1876 was that nearly plunged the country into civil war again, just about a decade after the war had ended. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, lost the popular vote and the electoral vote. And there were three states, though, that were still in question under Reconstruction, and a big meeting was held in Washington amongst the Democratic leaders and the Republican leaders, and the Southern leaders said, if you'll end Reconstruction, meaning the federal government will end it, and let us do what we want to with our situation down home, basically meaning the civil rights issues with the freedmen, we will give the votes to the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. And they did.
And that's also something that I think a lot of folks who are not familiar with history realize, the number of times that the nation really has changed based on a compromise for local reasons.
More so than we probably ever really think. That kind of influence is very strong, but the country was still so badly divided. Some of the southern states were still occupied militarily after the Civil War, and to free them, or as the term was, redeem those southern states, they were willing to give it to the Republicans, and they did.
Okay, so let's take us through what happens if the Electoral College is tied?
Then we are really in a mess because it has to go to the House of Representatives at that point. The Founding Fathers never intended, of course, for political parties to exist. So the original issue of the electors was that you vote for candidates, and the one who comes in with the most votes after the winner becomes the vice president. But that didn't work. And suddenly in 1800, you had electors voting for Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who was supposed to be the vice president, and they tied. And so it had to go to the House of Representatives. And then, of course, there had to be an amendment later issued in 1804, the 12th Amendment, which actually said you had to vote for a president and a vice president separately.
You stole my next question. Was about the 12 was about the so we know that there's been a tie in the Electoral College once. Has there ever been a tie in Congress?
Tie in Congress? Well, not as per se a tie in Congress. Mm-hmm. Now, on the vice presidency in 1837, a Kentuckian was the vice presidential candidate along with Democrat Martin Van Buren. It was Richard Mentor Johnson of Georgetown. And he was so unpopular with some of the more conservative elements within the Democratic Party that the electors refused to vote for him. That was due to he had a black mistress, which caused a lot of scandal at the time. And so Virginia's delegation absolutely refused to vote for him. And so the Senate had to actually vote and elect him as vice president.
Okay, so this actually brings this. Now, see, you took one question away from me, but you set up the next one.
Very good.
What are unfaithful or faithless electors?
Oh, those people. Well, in 26 states in the District of Columbia, you better not be a faithless elector because you can be fined, and of course you're politically ruined no matter what if you are a faithless elector. What that means is the people who are the electors, of course, have pledged to vote for a candidate, and they decide at the last minute they're not going to. That is what the founders meant for the Electoral College to be, because you were supposed to vote your conscience and who is best for the country. And so the faithless electors will vote for someone else. We've had faithless electors in several elections, 1948, 1960, 1968, 2000, 2016. We've had a lot of faithless electors, but only in the 26 states, and Kentucky is not among them. The electors can be fined if they do not follow the purview of the party. But in Kentucky, you could vote whichever way you wanted to, and nobody would do anything to you. But I truly doubt if you would ever show your face in a political party, a convention again.
Has anyone ever tested any of these laws as to whether they're constitutional in the states to force people to vote? Or
there has been all types of debates and arguments about it. Has there ever been a test case for the constitutionality? I don't recall one. Because it's very difficult to do anything like that because, again, you upset the state party machinery at that point, and you could cause all kinds of difficulty.
Okay, after last year's presidential election, we saw the defeat of Hillary Clinton despite winning the popular vote, and at least 3 states, Connecticut, Virginia, and Minnesota, are considering changing their states' laws so that the electors are divvied up by congressional district. And I think Maine and maybe Nebraska already do that, or some version of that.
They already do a form of that. Mm-hmm.
Do you know, are there any other states that are looking at that?
I know that several states since the last election are looking at it, but looking is all that they're doing right now. Because one of the things about the Electoral College, the elector system altogether, that would open a door literally to question the existence of the Electoral College. Is it really needed anymore? And that could be an entire political can of worms a lot of people do not want to touch because there'd have to be a constitutional amendment.
Thank you for setting up my next question, which is and I've heard a lot of people, particularly on the Democratic side over the last 15 years, given that twice in recent memory it's been the Republican Party who has put a president into office without winning the popular vote. What are the pros and cons of that? I mean, you've already mentioned the procedure. It would require a constitutional amendment.
Constitutional amendments are one of the most difficult things to ever get passed. In over 200 years, and we have the oldest working constitution in the world. You'd think England would, but theirs is not written. But our Constitution only has 27 amendments to it, and the first group of them, the first 10 amendments, was the Bill of Rights, and so we've not had that many amendments whatsoever. It's that difficult to get them passed.
And actually, one of them was repealing another one of them.
Exactly.
So really, we're talking about
But all of that, when you think about it, of trying to get on the ballot to get a constitutional amendment, all of the difficulties that would raise, it's more trouble than it's worth many times.
Can you take us through the process, though, real quick, of if someone did want to do a constitutional amendment?
Of course, you have to have a plebiscite, basically, that there would be a request that there would be an amendment to the Constitution. But then, when it did go to the votes, you would have to have 2/3 of the states actually agree to it. Now, getting 2/3 of the states to agree to anything is like Benjamin Franklin said about getting the colonies to agree to rebel against King George III. He said it's like getting 13 clocks to strike at the same time. It's next to impossible.
Well, kind of on the same topic, but getting off a little bit, Laura recently had an op-ed piece in the Kentucky Gazette talking about a movement that's afoot nationally to encourage a constitutional convention.
Yes.
And the inherent dangers in that, because the folks that are promoting it as an opportunity to make I think it's a balanced budget, to make that part of the Constitution. But once you go into that convention, it's pretty much up for grabs.
That would be a Pandora's box that any wise politician would steer clear of, because if a constitutional convention was held, it would be like the first one. That was done very clandestinely. Nothing was publicized to the American people. Of course, it was a much different time period. But if, say, we had the media we have now at the time the first constitutional convention was being held, it would have never happened.
No, it would have
never happened.
You would have had John Hancock in there tweeting about it, and
Well, you would have had several people that would have just probably said, no, I don't want anybody to know what I'm doing about this. Because remember, in the first constitutional convention, there was even the question that was actually raised whether or not we should have a monarchy again.
That was actually one of my earlier questions, and I skipped over it. How close did we come to having a monarchy?
Not close. Alexander Hamilton was the one who really was dedicated to the idea of an elected monarch, a constitutional monarch. And, of course, everyone had in mind George Washington, even at the point of the Constitutional Convention, except Washington would have nothing to do with anything making him a king.
Wasn't it John Adams who proposed the official title for the presidency?
His High and Mightiness?
Yeah.
Adams always wanted to have these grandiose titles, and they argued over that, what to call even the president, and finally it just came up Mr. President. that served very well. But yes, the monarchy thing, there's still some people in this country, believe it or not, who I would say are pseudo-constitutional monarchists.
Really?
That really would feel better if we had that figurehead. You know, in this country, it's not like England. You have the queen or the king that you can rally around for king and country or queen and country. We have the flag here, but some people want an actual person. And of course, then you would have something along the line of a prime minister that would be the political part of that. But yeah, there are still some people who think that constitutional monarchy is the salvation of America.
Wow. Okay, to get back to the Electoral College, if Kentucky, and I don't recall anybody having pre-filed a bill, and I'm not sure whether there would be will to or not, but what would it take in Kentucky to change how the electors are elected from the winner-take-all system to the
There would have to, again, be something at the statewide level to do that. If the political parties themselves tried to do it, of course, that would not that wouldn't work. So you would nearly have to have another plebiscite to actually go through and say, this is what we're going to change. And at that point, you're getting into murky waters again. You have to look at Kentucky's Constitution. You have to look at everything of that nature. And of course, there's been many, many times that in the past, probably 50 years, that people have wanted to change Kentucky's Constitution. But that's, again, very difficult to do. It's about the same like on the national level.
Okay. We're going to veer off just a little bit again, but this is something that I've heard several people ask and seen news commentators wonder about. If the allegations were to prove true that the Trump campaign colluded with a foreign government to fix the outcome of the election, what happens? Does the Constitution have anything to say about that?
Well, yes. If you find anyone who has actually done anything with a foreign power that in any way, shape, form, or fashion could influence American policy, or especially elections, you just name it, you're bordering on high treason at that point.
So we're looking at impeachment.
Oh.
Is there a mechanism within the Constitution to undo the election?
No, not at this point. There would not be. Again, the sitting president, if he was found to be in collusion with a foreign power, he would have to be impeached and removed. Okay. Now, if the vice president was found to be in collusion with the power, then we're going to go down the whole line of who would succeed.
Speaker of the House, Senate, pro tem.
Keep going down.
Yeah.
And, of course...
Till we get to Kiefer Sutherland.
Exactly. Could be. But that is something that in American history, we have not even had anywhere near that to ever happen. And, again, whether Donald Trump was, for example, personally involved in any of this, or some of his staffers were. Now, if Trump himself had no knowledge of it or anything like that, the staffers would be the ones that would be.
But there's nothing in the Constitution to undo an election. It's done.
It's an election.
Accept
You would
it.
have to
Move forward.
If something happened that say that it was proven that the election had been rigged in some way, then the only thing I can think of, it would have to be a new election called.
And does the Constitution allow for that?
I can't even say that it says that actually in words, but that's the nearest thing that could be done.
Okay.
That would be fair. But again, you could border on civil unrest trying to do that. And I avoid saying civil war, but civil unrest would be probably an understatement.
Yeah, I would say I think you're lowballing it there, but that could be very.
You don't. The intensity of the last election, for example, how really people were so angry, and I saw more emotion spilled than this. And I told some of my colleagues, I said, the only thing this reminds me of is the election of 1860. The country was so badly divided, and we don't have the issue of slavery to worry about right now, but all the other things, it's that same intensity, that same feeling that I am going to have it my way or else.
Well, and the thing that we do have, and we've had since the beginning, is the Constitution to fall back on.
That is the most important thing. That's the lex suprema, the supreme law of the land. And you cannot, from the Constitution, we really should not have any recourse. The Constitution can be amended. That's what the founders intended it for it to be, but it was to be a document that was sacrosanct too. I mean, if there was nearly a holy document in America, it is the Constitution, even more so than the Declaration of Independence.
I think from that answer, I know the answer to my last question, but I'm going to ask it anyhow. Electoral College, yes or no? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad?
Personally, I like it. I really do like it, because maybe it's still a little bit of the old fashioned person in me, but there should be some method of keeping perhaps emotion from totally ruling our politics, and the founders were so afraid of mob mentality. You've got to remember, our revolution set off a string of revolutions, the French Revolution being the bloodiest right after ours, but they did not want mob rule. And so if, say, emotions ran so high that an absolute, Hitler-like figure was going to run for the presidency, that some electors might be brave enough to step forward and say no. So I still support it.
Ron Bryant, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. We love your columns in the Gazette and look forward to reading more soon. And hopefully you'll come back and do another podcast with us real soon.
Glad to. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leo and Ron, for an interesting look at the Electoral College. Ron's original article was published in the January 31st issue of the Kentucky Gazette. Subscribe to the Gazette so you won't miss any of Ron's articles or any other in-depth coverage provided by the Kentucky Gazette. You can subscribe by going to our website, www.kentuckygazette.com/subscribe. To stay up to date on what's going on in Frankfort or D.C. in between podcasts and issues of the Kentucky Gazette, you can follow us on Twitter at Kentucky Gazette or on Facebook at /Kentucky Gazette. We also invite you to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a good review. That will do it for this episode of the Kentucky Gazette podcast. Leo and I will be back next week with a look inside the next issue of the Kentucky Gazette. I'm Laura Cullen Glasscock. Thank you for listening.
The Kentucky Gazette podcast is a production of the Kentucky Gazette. Copyright 2017, Gravel Switch Publishing. The podcast is produced in the studios of TCHQ Communications in Frankfort, Kentucky. Thank you for listening.